All right. Hey, Hank, Paul Sponcia, thanks for joining us again.
Glad to be here.
So I want to, for those kind of watching slash listening, Hank is on audio, I'm on video. I want to sort of reintroduce Hank. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to let him tell everyone about himself. But Hank did a lunch and learn with us about 3 or 4 weeks ago, talking a lot about just cyber warfare. Hank has a really extensive background military in the military for that. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Hank, and for any introductions and anything else you need to give us before we jump in.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk here again. I think that if you want to have the complete background for this follow-on Q&A, it would be good to watch the video from the lunch and learn. I'm not going to cover down on everything I talked in that now, but brief background is grew up in doing outdoors activities, went to the Naval Academy, became a Marine officer, and through the Marine Corps had lots of different security type responsibilities, as well as ended up doing some finance, and finally ended up in cyberspace operations, which included offense and defense. And then through that last assignment, I started studying more broadly what risks were to our dependencies on the internet and everything that is connected via the internet. And I realized those were fairly broad, and we should be doing things collectively to mitigate those risks. I do want to mention at the beginning of this, and I think I have a disclaimer in the video also, but any views here that I express are my own. They don't reflect anything from the U.S. government or from any of the companies I work for or have previously worked for. It's just based on my own research and my own opinions.
Awesome. Great. Well, I wanted to jump in. Hank and I know each other a little bit more than just from a business perspective. Just from a fun perspective, I bought my dog from Hank, and he is the cousin of a friend. And so there's all these, as we always talk about 5 degrees of separation, I think we may be 1 degree separated. So that's how we got to know each other. But one thing I know about Hank is he's doing something really cool to use his experience and expertise to try to help others, called Plan Bravo. So I would love it, Hank, if you would just take 5 minutes or so and sort of tell everyone what Plan Bravo is, what your heart is, what you're trying to accomplish, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I regret that I'm rolling this out now and didn't roll it out 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah.
But it was my intention to. In fact, I had a program of actions and milestones that had us launching this at Christmas, but I just couldn't find the right voice for it. And oddly, after Christmas, I found a marketing firm that's now helping me, ironically called Visual Voice, and they're helping me find the right way to bring this forward, which I appreciate. So I mentioned in my opening remarks on this piece that I started studying more broadly what the risks were. I know firsthand what the cyber risks are, and I call it the fragility, if you will, of the internet. But I've also had an opportunity to travel. I've seen first world countries that have devolved into third world countries. I've done some disaster relief as a volunteer. I've been in a couple of disasters. So I just have, I think, a fairly unique viewpoint of how likely it is that the infrastructure that we enjoy and a lot of people treat as if it is some type of natural state that will continue, like water will always flow and the electricity will always be on. The latter is just not true. The electricity will not always be on. It's man-made, and the more we try to gain efficiencies, the more fragile that system becomes. And a lot of people right now are, it's similarly true in just-in-time logistics. The efficiencies we've gained in the past couple of decades, business-wise in logistics, have resulted in a system that's efficient and keeps prices down, but also doesn't have the ability to scope and scale if market demands change rapidly. And a lot of people have experienced that at the beginning of COVID-19, and stores not being able to keep in stock things that they wanted to have at home for themselves. So there's a tension I talked about in the lunch and learn brief I gave. That's kind of a standard metric in information security, and that's the tension between confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information. So what if one of those is emphasized, the others are naturally de-emphasized. You can't give 300% effort to something. There's a division of that level of effort. So in our current systems, if we emphasize things like availability and speed and efficiency, then what gets de-emphasized is things like durability, ability to scale and scope, et cetera. So what I did was, I think when I was doing the cyberspace work, and I still am doing that work, I started looking more broadly, as I mentioned, at the risks. And I read a great book by Ted Koppel, who most people know of him as a responsible reporter, called Lights Out. And I would recommend it to everybody. It's written in layman's terms, and it lays out the risks, but not really what you can do about it, to the infrastructure, and I would say primarily to electricity and the internet and all of the things that are dependent on those two things. Most modern things that we enjoy have a dependency on one or both of those, and they're fragile. So as you and I talked about before, Paul, there's not a lot we can do about the risk itself as individuals. We can encourage. Ted Koppel points out that it doesn't benefit a politician to run on a platform of increased cybersecurity. That's not really a tenable platform. It may be something that is important, but it's hard to get votes off of from that. So the only way that becomes more tenable in a preventative way is for us as individuals to express the desire that we have. We're willing to make some sacrifices as a country or a community to mitigate the risk. But what you can do individually, so you can't change the risk of a foreign government attacking our utility grid yourself individually. But what you can do is prepare your household for that. And so in the prepper world, some people call it risk agnostic, or they have some some description that matches that. I would, and that's my pursuit. Is there's so many different risks. You can read about it if you'll be able to download my book for free in a week or so. Is what you can do to create a buffer, if you will, for your family. And so my basic premise is to pre-purchase things that you would use anyway, so that you have a 2-week supply on hand, and that enables you, if there's some type of disruption, to buy space and time, which is a military term, for you and your family to adjust to the new conditions. So instead of being immediately desperate, you're able to think about what the changes have been and then start acting in proactive ways to do what I would say is staying in front of the curve of disruption. You don't want to get behind that curve, and I've written on that a little bit too. So with the pre-purchase mentality, you're not buying things that you're not going to use in most cases. You're buying things only in advance. So the only cost to you is what in finance they call the cost of capital, that you could have, the opportunity cost of buying a can of green beans instead of investing that in the stock market would be a kind of a funny example. Yeah. So, so you pre-purchase things, you create a buffer for yourself. And there's also a community benefit to that. If a lot of people had 2 weeks of basic needs in their home when the coronavirus first started becoming real to people, then that would have reduced the stress on our supply system, on the supply chain, because fewer people would have been rushing to the store. Yeah. We were fortunate. We had this buffer, and so we continued to shop as we always do, but we did not have to do any kind of stockpiling, if you will, as a last-minute resort. So
it's interesting. We as a family, I've been following along with what you've been doing. Sorry to interrupt, but we, I would not say that we maybe consciously, to the degree that you are doing it, thought about it, but we had typically always bought like maybe 2 or 3 things of milk, and we'd always bought extra paper towels and toilet, and things we'd always sort of done. And part of it's just because I don't like to go to the store a whole lot, so I wanted to always have extra supply, But when this happened, we did not feel really a tremendous amount of pressure. I did go to the store one time, but that was only because I felt like we were a couple of days away from everybody rushing it, and I wanted to get a couple of things that I felt like we would need over the next week or two, but they weren't the basic staples like toilet paper and paper towels and milk. There are a few other things. So it's pretty interesting. Even I think in knowing you and reading your things that you've been putting out, I don't know if subconsciously, subliminally, it happened to me, but we were already in that kind of position to where we didn't have any reason to rush the store.
And I'm really glad to hear that's the case. There's been of the couple of dozen people who've been in the orbit of trying to plan the book. So I have an advisory group, and Paul's on that distribution chain. A lot of people have said that it was beneficial to them to be part of the conversation in leading up to this. I would say another advantage. So if you apply this pre-purchase methodology, it does require a little bit of discipline. But you take your grocery list and you, based on your budget, you divide it by the number of weeks that you think it would take you to, so if you can spend an extra 2.5% per week, then it'll take you a year. 5%. It'll take you a year to build up 2 weeks of supplies. And that could be a very nominal effect on you that you could probably offset by just, buying generic or something like that.
Yeah.
So if you're doing that over time, then what you'll find happens is you see stuff on sale that's part of your list, and that's when you plus up that item, and so you have some savings from buying slightly in bulk. There's always a risk to buying in bulk, and that's that you end up consuming more.
Yeah.
So you want to put it on some type of pantry for storage where it doesn't just become extra potato chips to eat or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's achievable that way. And sure, nobody's going to be perfectly prepared. If that's where you start drifting into what some people would consider to be an extreme prepper. If they're trying to be 100% prepared for everything. And there's a lot to be learned from people who are pursuing that, but they've also made it kind of the central focus in their life. And that's not the azimuth I'm taking here. I'm taking the azimuth of, let's just do this extra thing, like we have a fire extinguisher and a smoke alarm in our house to mitigate the risk of fire. We have a couple of extra weeks of food sitting in a closet that we use, and we cycle through it. But it's there as a small amount of mitigation against this risk.
Yeah. So a couple things before we move on to the next question. I'd love to just make sure. There was one thing you said, which is Lights Out by Ted Koppel. I want to make sure everybody heard that. If you have a chance to grab that book. The second thing is you have a book coming out, I guess an ebook. Is that what it's eventually going to be it's an ebook that people can download.
Yeah, in the interest of expediency, because I feel like there's probably some lessons learned that I've had in just my research or experiences over the years that would help people now. We're going to jump into some simple posts on Facebook, and then I will link on Facebook a way to download a PDF of the book.
Right.
It's going through the final revision right now and getting cleaned up. And then eventually, if people find it useful, and the download's free, there's no ads, nothing. Eventually, if people find it useful, then I'll try to get a downloadable Kindle version. And then for people who want a paper copy, one that they can buy that might offset the publication cost or something like that.
All right.
So that's coming, but we're trying to get the information out there right now in a meaningful way, that people can utilize it.
Is there anywhere I can tell people to go yet, or no? Is there a Facebook? Do you have your Facebook page launched yet, or is that coming in the next week or two? Or
it's coming in the next week. We're still working through, not on Facebook, but like URLs for the website.
Okay. And it'll be called Plan Bravo, so people could obviously search for Hank Brown or Henry Brown, Plan Bravo, and probably find it.
Right. Well, and maybe you can do me a favor and hang it on your website, and people
will.
Can pull it from there. So
yeah, once you get it, I'll definitely post it on LinkedIn and Facebook and all of our different places. And we're putting up a resources page actually, just because of this, with some of the videos that we've already recorded, and we'll make sure it's on there as well. So
okay. Thanks for that.
Yeah. So, and thanks for doing what you're doing. I mean, I know just what I know of you. I know your heart is to serve and to help, and it's not about any type of financial gain. So you're doing something. I think it's a big deal that, and people should recognize that you're not doing it for any other reason really than just to help people. And if that means some value to you, then that's just a bonus. So I appreciate it.
I hope I get some fulfillment about it, but really it's just a matter of my conscience. I feel like I have a comprehension and a vision that my experiences have made me the beneficiary of, and so hopefully I can help some others by sharing some of the insights and helping them be a little bit more prepared.
Yeah. Well, I want to do, and part of this is a follow-up to the Lunch and Learn, but I think that's, so much has just changed from what we're just talking about. Like, we're a month ago in our Lunch and Learn, you're talking about, cyber warfare, and maybe there was a little bit of this thing hanging out there with COVID-19. And then, fast forward a month later, and it's like, the world is basically economically in a crisis, health-wise in a crisis. Like, there's just all this uncertainty and craziness that's going on. And I'm curious, from your perspective, I don't know if you're seeing things, I know we are, but how do you see if we go back to just cyber warfare, how do you see these maybe, criminals, nation states, whatever, how do you see them exploiting or starting to exploit our weaknesses? And is there anything that people need to be on the lookout for?
So there's a term called the sophisticated adversary. And so if you want to characterize people who are trying to take actions through cyberspace with a malevolent intent, that's where the term malware comes from, then there's different organizations that have characterized them as kind of tiered them and how serious they are, how good they are at their trade craft. And the ones of greatest concern are nation states and highly organized criminal activities that have a lot of resources. And sometimes the lines between those two become blurred because nation states can use criminals as proxies to try to achieve they can finance them, and then they help that nation state achieve their means with some plausible deniability. I talked about this in the Lunch and Learn, but if it's a sophisticated adversary, then they're going to apply warfare techniques, if you will. And one of those techniques is to attack targets at their weakest point, but also to time their attacks so that it's the most advantageous to them and the least advantageous to the target, if you will. And that could be in a physical attack, it could be in a cyber attack. And so I think that in any case where there's a disruption or a distraction, then an opportunist is going to try to take advantage of that timing to his or her, to achieve their own objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can see that in the news. There are people trying to scam other people out of their federal relief money already. Anything that's new, it's chaos, and there's a figure of speech. There's opportunity and chaos, and that's both for good people and bad. And so there's people who lack a conscience are not going to not use the situation to their advantage because of the pandemic. They will take full advantage of it, and there will not be a moral quandary on their side for it. Mm-hmm. So you can do your own research, but it's pretty obvious cyber attacks are up. There was a cyber attack against, I think, Health and Human Services a couple of weeks ago, to go back to, some individuals having no moral quandary whatsoever. One of the very organizations that's trying to help people survive this gets a cyber attack. The smart thing, I'm not saying it's the right thing, but the smart thing for an attacker is if a target's distracted by something else, then defenses are down. They may be more willing to give up ransom or something like that. And you saw that. And I'm not saying nor do I know that there's any direct linkage, but after the shooting at the Pensacola Naval Station a few weeks ago, tragic as it was, the very next day, the city was under a cyber attack for ransomware. And I would suspect that the attacker timed that to coincide with those things.
Mm-hmm.
So the takeaway should be again, not looking at the causality. With the pandemic, there are lots of subjective observations people have that make all of us characterize the pandemic itself differently. Some people think it's more serious than others. What we should look at is the outcomes, and the outcomes are less difficult to characterize, and that is distracted leadership, distracted population, lots of new internet apertures being opened, lots of reconfiguration of systems. All of those things create opportunities to be exploited by an attacker. The last thing I'll say is we should consider that some of our potential attackers, they're not being affected the same way that we are.
Right.
So they may be better positioned to act at some time when we're weakest, and they have recovered, or maybe have not been affected yet. Either way, but that's the time.
Yeah.
And so, as difficult as it would be for our financial institutions or our utility grid to come under attack on any given day from a sophisticated adversary, it would be much more difficult when everybody's working from home. Many people who protect the internet are not at their workstations right now, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we had hoped to do on the Lunch and Learn, I ended up not being able to be there because I was sick, was do some practical from our side, the technical side. So this, what I'm about to say is nothing that Hank and I have discussed really in depth or pre-rehearsed, but so some things really to talk about what you just said, like there has been a flood of reconfiguration, a flood of people working from home, using Zoom and Microsoft Teams and home computers that maybe don't have the same type of security infrastructure on them that their work computers may have, and they did that fast because they needed to do it fast. So from our perspective, we want to make sure people are, being sure that if they're using home computers that they're securing those or talking to whoever their IT staff, department, company is. Two-factor authentication is huge, while two-factor does have ways it can be exploited, it's much, much more difficult. And I think what I've learned in the industry is it's like anything else. An attacker is going to try to attack the low-hanging fruit, the areas that are easy. So not having things with two-factor authentication is one of those. I think that you actually are increasing some of your risk on some of your home devices too, because now if the home device is not a device that's been sort of vetted and brought through the enterprise's means for securing it, that home device is also accessing your bank accounts and, all these other things, your home security system, these other things that could now be exploited to exploit your work environment too. So really working with your IT staff to understand what you have at home and be sure that you're trying to create as many walls and that you can create, and to minimize, as Hank says, the attack surface. So if you have a camera, cover the camera when you're not using it. If you're using Zoom, make sure that you've been watching some of the ways to make sure it's secure, because there's been a lot of talk about how Zoom is being exploited right now. So those are the practical things I think of, is just, two-factor authentication. Make sure you have security protocols on your home computer. If you brought a computer from work, then make sure that you're not letting your kids play on it, and some of the basic things. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Hank. If you would have anything that you would say.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think that you could say most people have probably heard of using computer hygiene. So virtually, you're being careful about the ways that you can conduct yourself online. You don't go someplace that you may suspect is dirty, if you will. And so just as we've increased our hygiene in the physical world right now because of the pandemic, we should be doing the same thing in some of the new and unknown territory, if you will, of all these reconfigured systems. And I would second the limiting your apertures. I think that every time you connect something to your home network, you should consider where it has been and how it might be able to transfer data or load software onto your system. All of those things can be utilized to your disadvantage, and you should not discount that a computer attack could come to you from a physical sense. There are lots of ploys to use social engineering or otherwise. A free CD or a free USB or a cord or all these different things. Everything should be authenticated, and then I would just minimize the introduction of new things.
Mm-hmm.
New seems neat sometimes, but maybe it's not absolutely necessary when we're trying to be cautious.
Well, one of the things that we've done, or I've done, at my home from the beginning, I do have a lot of different devices, but I have a separate network where all those kind of IoT devices, to the extent that they can be, so home security camera, any of that stuff is all isolated from my regular network, and as well as my work network. So a little easier for me to do than the average person. But a lot of the technology out there today from companies have made it pretty easy to set up, at least a guest or a second kind of wireless network, if you will, to connect some of these devices to. So if you do have, Amazon devices and cameras, if that is something you have, it would be important to keep them off the normal network that you're also connecting to your work computer and all that stuff too. Or, if you have a work computer and your company provides you with a work phone, consider using the Wi-Fi off your phone instead of using the Wi-Fi at your house. That's another thing we tell people that a lot when it comes to going to hotspots, like don't go to Starbucks or the airport and connect, just use your phone. And so it's kind of the same thing. If you don't feel like you have to use what Hank said, a super clean cyber hygiene at your home, then just avoid it. Disconnect from it and use your mobile device to connect.
Yeah. How do you feel about VPNs, Paul?
I think it is definitely risky. Are you talking about the VPNs, like the commercial VPNs, or just using a VPN to connect to your work network?
No, like a commercially provided VPN. Oh. So like a corporate VPN.
Yeah, I think the challenge with that is when you connect a corporate VPN to your home computer, you've actually increased the attack surface, because now that home computer that you don't know anything about, the corporate network knows anything about, is now potentially on your corporate network. So we've tried to, we have recommended strongly and tried to manage it strongly with our customers that if you're, obviously if you're taking a work laptop home, that's fine. But if you're connecting a home computer, then we need to do some type of checklist to make sure that home computer has antivirus, endpoint detection, the various technologies that we deploy on it to protect it. So we think it's okay, but not with just a regular home computer that everybody uses for the kids use and everything else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and using two-factor on the VPN is important too, so that when you connect to the VPN, yes, you have to use two-factor authentication. So.
Yeah. Ultimately, you want to be a harder target than other similar targets, and yes, the adversary is going to go somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah, they're like we said, it's kind of like just a really simple example. It's like carjacking. This is a crazy thing I saw in San Francisco when I was there back in October. We were on our way to Sausalito, and I don't know if you know that point area out there where you can overlook the bridge and the bay and everything. On the other side of the bridge, on the Sausalito side, there were just kids literally in a car. They would jump out of the car and yank doors. I mean, I'm just watching them do this, but if you think about what they're doing, they're just looking for the person that left the car unlocked, and so I think that's a good example of what cyber criminals are doing. They're looking for the doors that are unlocked that they can get into really easily, and they don't have to have a lot of effort, because that's easy, versus if you make it difficult, they're just going to bypass you and go on to that until they've exploited all those.
Yeah, I would agree with that, unless you're a specific target. But
yes,
you can't make yourself I talked about this in the Lunch and Learn. You can't make yourself 100% protected, if you will.
Yeah.
If you do, then you don't have availability to the information. But
right,
you can do a lot of simple things to make yourself more protected than most, and that would be my recommendation.
Exactly. Well, and our third thing that we discussed a little bit was, which I love, this whole idea is, we are going to get past this, whether that's 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. None of us actually know. We sure hope it's sooner than later. But we're going to learn a lot from this. So what would be, if you were running a business and this thing was on its way over, let's say 45 days from now, we're on the tail end, we're starting to see some economic activity pick back up, you're a business owner, like, man, I made it through this. What do you do? What's the one, maybe one or two things you'd first engage in?
So if I were running any organization, of course, to include a business, right now I would be planning my recovery. I might not know what the date is. In military operations, like the reason they called the D-Day invasion D-Day was because the day of the invasion was not known until they designated it, and then it became D-10, D-9, D-8 until they got to D-Day. And so at some point in the taper of this, if you have a plan, a program of action and milestones that lays out your intentions for recovering the business, then you can enact that rather than starting to plan when you think the recovery has begun. And of course, any plan you have to shift off of it, but it's better to have that plan in place, and everybody on your team can be preparing with you.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that plan would be to conduct what, again, in the military we call a hot wash. Comes from when the vehicles are still hot after an exercise or operation, you're washing them down for the first time, but everybody's mind is still in the middle of the operation. And so I would have part of that planning in your recovery to do a hot wash or a quick after action and start capturing the lessons learned and what you want to do differently to mitigate, I would not say the risk of a pandemic, but I would say a disruption to our society, to yourself and your business and your customers and your employees. Because as I mentioned earlier, the causality to those disruptions is wide and varied, but the net result can be very similar in nature.
Yeah. What are the key elements typically of a hot wash or an after action review on the military side? I assume you can discuss this. I don't actually know, but are there?
Oh yeah.
Are there 3 things, 5 things? Like what would that typically look like?
Right. So an overarching key element is check your ego at the door. Okay. So if in the middle of this, you, Paul, as the owner of your company, you realize that you made some mistake, then come in and talk about the mistake that you made. And that should go for everybody. And so if it's somebody who, is junior in the organization, they should know that there's not going to be retribution for their identifying that. That creates an environment where people are most likely to be transparent and share what they really learned.
Yeah.
If they think they're being evaluated on what they're sharing, they might be less likely to.
Yeah. Which goes I think which goes to, as leader, I think you may have said that you should be the first one to be vulnerable, because then everybody else will feel comfortable being vulnerable too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say, well, here's what I learned. And I mean, there could be positive lessons too. As a leader, I wouldn't say, well, it's my lesson learned that this organization was clearly led through the crisis. But for you to say, here's some things that I would do differently. It should be a blame game on anybody's part. It should be, here's the observation and here's what we do differently. Mm-hmm. What the framework that I would use, and there's lots of variations of this, but would be, people come in and it can be very informally written, but a topic, a description of whatever the observation was, and then a recommendation to come from that. Mm-hmm. And on all of those, I would recommend they be brief. The solutioning can occur later, but for now, it's just the identification while it's close to home. Okay. That's great. One of the last things I wanted to talk about, which maybe is the fallout, or not the fallout, that's not a good way to use it or term it, but one of the results of, the hot wash after action review is something you and I have discussed a lot, which is, this idea of having a plan, and in our world we call it disaster recovery, incident response, crisis management, and then you really turned me on to a term that we hadn't really spoken much about in the IT world, which is this whole idea of continuity of operations, which we do have what's called a business continuity plan, which is typically rolled in a little bit with the disaster recovery, so maybe the same thing. But I'd love to, I'd love to hear from the military perspective, how I assume that's a normal course of action in the military. These things are in place. Like you have these type of things already pre-built, and working through them all the time. Because this seems of like, I feel like everybody all of a sudden is like, wow, now I see why we needed that plan. I never believed you before, but now I get it.
Mm-hmm. I think I got continuity of operations more from the information security field than from military. I'd have to think back on it. But it's a theme, of course, that you're right, that resonates in the military, because in military operations there's always a risk that key personnel or parts of an organization may be disabled. Mm-hmm. And so you have a lot of times you have two chains of command, and they're physically dislocated from each other, an alpha and a bravo chain, that kind of thing. And so in peacetime that can seem very duplicitous. In a wartime, it may be what enables us to continue operations, right?
Yeah.
So I think that without having, there's always a resource question here. But I think it's very unlikely you're going to be able to buy insurance that's meaningful to offset the risk of disruptions to society. So you need to self-insure. And you can self-insure through plans, because everybody has really been exercising continuity of operations for the last few weeks. Many of them have been making it up as they go.
Right.
And so as part of that after action, they can look at it and say, well, wow, here's how we did it. Here's what we learned from it. Now let's take these lessons and turn them into a plan that next time we say, go to page 1 and here's what you do.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and a key to that, is actually testing it, tabletop testing, of your plan. That a lot of people will write a disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan, then just kind of stick it in the files, and they never actually do anything with it. And then it happens, they pull it out, it's outdated, things have changed. So that's an important piece of that too, that I would say as a takeaway for folks, which I wrote 3 things down, which I think are super, super, super practical, which is, if I was a business, which I am, but if I was advising, my customers right now, I would take Hank's advice of start to plan your recovery now. Go ahead and put a program of action with milestones in place, and realize, I heard multiple people say this time and time again, as plans change because the situation changes. What was it? Muhammad Ali how does he say it again, Hank? Your best plans go out the window when
something like
face or something.
The best laid plans sound great until someone gets punched in the face.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Or in
the military, they say,
battlefield.
Until the first bullet flies. But the benefit of the plan is you have an opportunity to pivot from that plan, and everybody has the same pivot point. Yeah. Rather than making stuff up as you go.
So plan your
recovery. So you mentioned
now.
Sure. Yeah. Plan your recovery now. And you mentioned like there are. I think if there's a metric to the value add of planning and then rehearsing the plan, I think it's a diminishing return. So if you have this before Operation Iraqi Freedom 1, and General Mattis writes about this in his book, Call Sign Chaos. They did a terrain model of the Iraqi terrain that they were going to attack through that was the size, I think, of a football field. And people wore jerseys to indicate units, and they walked through the plan day after day after day, rehearsing this plan. Yeah. And they executed it beautifully. But that was, there was a tremendous investment that went to that. Way upstream of that was planners wrote down a plan, and then they did a tabletop exercise. And a tabletop exercise is something you could do at a lunch and learn internally. You could just have an extended lunch and walk through the plan and have people talk about it and ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a facilitator would be helpful, somebody objective from the outside.
Yeah.
And then from that, lots of people would have a very good starting point for moving forward.
Okay, so plan your recovery now, which includes the after action review, which some of the elements are check your ego at the door, be vulnerable, no blame game, focus on identifying and recommending, not necessarily ultimately a solution. And then the last thing I wrote down is the best way to self-insure yourself is through planning, which we talked about. Plan your recovery now, do an after action review, but after all that's over with, take all that information, all what you've learned, and go back through the process of incident response, crisis management, disaster recovery, business continuity of operations. So those are just, to me, one of the things I wanted to give people as a takeaway was what are some really simple things that you could do, and these are not necessarily simple. It takes work and it takes time, but I think spending time now planning your recovery, working through some after action reviews, even now, I think if you did one at week by week, you would probably learn a lot about what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately take all that data and work through those 4 plans: incident response, disaster recovery, continuity of operations, and crisis management. And people probably come on the backside a lot stronger. And the last 2 things I want to say before I wrap up and whatever else you have is, I think everybody should get a copy of Lights Out, and then pay attention for what we post on when Hank gets his stuff for Plan Bravo out there, because it'll be very helpful for people. So, do you have any?
Yeah, I hope the Plan Bravo is helpful, and if it's not, then I'd like that feedback also.
Yeah.
So I don't need to waste my time, or if I can shift in order to be more effective. I can speak personally and say that our family has been resilient through this thus far, not in a perfect way, but our planning had benefits, and we did not incur a lot of additional expense other than the pre-purchases that I mentioned. And the way we've broken it down is into some short manuals. So these will be like handbooks that hopefully are enough to get the point across without becoming a big project for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the first 2 manuals have traction, if we feel like they're helping others, then we'll continue to publish follow-on manuals, and that gives people to kind of pick and choose also what they may be interested in. Maybe they're interested in being prepared for more than a couple weeks, or maybe they're interested in some kind of specific consideration. Lots of people in this conversation want to bring up like firearms and things like that, and that's a whole nother realm if you're going to get into that. That shouldn't be addressed, on a couple of pages of a handbook.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's the long-term plan if it's helpful to other people. So
good.
Yeah, I definitely would appreciate people's feedback on Facebook or reaching out to me individually, whatever.
Well, we appreciate you. Any final thoughts or anything before I stop recording, before we wrap up?
No, I'm assuming that people are going to be listening to this in the middle of the pandemic. I wish everyone the best. I think that one of the biggest challenges in something like this is we don't have a shared sense of what normalcy is, and so that can cause friction between people or families or friends, and so we have to offer each other a lot of grace right now. And my personal position is, since we don't know exactly what's happening around us, to take a conservative approach, to be the abundance of caution piece, that more than likely, if we look back on it and say, maybe we overreacted a little bit. My kid shouldn't have missed that birthday party or something like that. That's far better in my mind than dismissing it and missing the mark on the dismissal, and all of a sudden you became part of the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is a tough and delicate balance, but it's the decision between maybe going a little overboard and being okay versus dismissing it and regretting, that I think you would regret the negative outcome of what could happen a lot more than maybe missing a thing or two over the next, 4 to 6 weeks or so, or even the past few. I think, we have a new baby, and it's certainly been a challenge to be mostly homebound through that. But I'd rather protect our children and our ultimate livelihood than not, and put up those risks. So those are good words. So.
Well, and there's certainly challenges here, but there's absolutely opportunities as well.
Yeah.
Anytime we have a chance, and there was a Wall Street Journal article on this yesterday or today, anytime we have the chance to push the reset button, that's an opportunity. And so I would encourage people, instead of just immersing yourself in entertainment, to lift your head up and take a breath and evaluate everything that's in your life, and use this time to make changes if you think that change would be healthy.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I appreciate you, Hank. I'm going to stop recording, but if you'll stick around, we'll just catch up and finish up. But I appreciate you being with us, and I know the folks that will listen will appreciate just your insight and your experience being shared with us. So we thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.